Genevieve Moore's voice cut across the hall like glass.
Hands off the wall. Your filthy hands. Don't touch what's ours.
The girl lowered her hand, soft, steady.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I was finding my daddy's name.
Finding?
God, that smell.
Someone drag it back to the gutter before it breeds.
Please.
The girl bent down, trembling.
Go find your mother's mop before you stain something worth more than your life.
The room laughed, glasses raised, eyes bright with cruel delight. The girl didn't move. She just looked up at one name carved in brass, her father's name, and breathed in. Because when she sang her first note, the room that laughed froze. The city had a way of dressing up its cruelty in gold. That night, the old concert hall on Carnegie Street wore its finest. Crystal chandeliers threw soft light across marble floors, and the air smelled of lilies and aged champagne. Waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts between the tables, balancing silver trays. 200 of the wealthiest names in the state had gathered for the conservatory's annual benefit, a night where old money came to admire itself and call it charity. Near the kitchen doors, a woman in a gray catering uniform wiped down a tray with practiced hands. Della Anderson had worked banquets for 11 years, long enough to know the rules. Stay invisible, smile at no one, disappear into the walls. Tonight, she needed this job more than ever, and tonight, for the first time, her daughter was working beside her. Ruby was 19. She had taken the extra shift herself, the way she took every shift she could find, because rent was 3 weeks late, and a second pair of hands meant a second paycheck. She moved quietly through the back of the hall in a borrowed apron over a thin, second-hand dress, the hem frayed, the cuffs worn soft from washing. She did not belong among the silk and the diamonds, and she knew it, and she had long ago stopped letting it sting. But there was another reason she had wanted this shift, a reason she had not told her mother. His name was on the wall. Otis Anderson, her father. 4 years gone now, taken by a winter and a heart that gave out too soon. But once, before the sickness, he had stood on the stage in this very hall and sung until grown men wept. He had a voice that could quiet a crowded room, the kind people drove across 3 counties to hear. And in the marble lobby, on a brass plaque listing every artist who had graced that stage, his name was carved in gold letters. He had told her about it near the end, his voice thin as paper. They put my name on a wall there, baby. Said I sang like the building was built for it. Ruby had inherited that voice. Everyone who had ever heard her said so. As a girl, she had sung in church until the congregation forgot to breathe, and for a while, she had believed the world would make room for a voice like hers. The world had not. There had been no money for a conservatory, no money for a coach, no connections to open a single door. She had mailed audition tapes that came back unanswered. She had stood in line at open calls and watched them wave the trained girls through and send her home without a hearing. By the time she was 17, she had stopped trying, because hope, she had learned, was just a slower way of being told no. Now she carried trays, and she hummed only when she thought no one could hear, and she had folded the dream up small and put it away. But she still kept one thing. In the pocket of her dress, soft as cloth from years of handling, was a folded square of paper. A lullaby her father had written for her, the words copied out in his slanted hand. She did not need to read it. She knew every line. So when the night offered a quiet moment, Ruby slipped away from the kitchen, down the long marble lobby, to find his name. Not to wander, not to steal, only to press her fingers to the cold brass and feel, for a breath, that a man like him had belonged here once, and that some thread of him still did. She found it. 3rd column, near the bottom. Otis Anderson. She had just raised her hand to touch it when the voice came down on her like glass breaking, and the laughter began, and her mother appeared at the edge of the crowd with her face gone white. Della reached her a moment later and pulled her back toward the kitchen, her grip tight, her whisper fierce and frightened. "What did I tell you? These people sign the checks. One word from her and we are both gone. Tonight you are invisible. You don't speak, you don't sing, you don't even breathe loud. Promise me." Ruby looked at her mother's frightened face, and something in her went quiet. "I promise," she said. She did not yet know it was a promise she would have to break. For a while, Ruby kept her promise. She stayed in the back. She folded napkins because her hands needed something to do. She watched the night unfold through the doorway, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the slow waltz of the very rich. And she tried not to listen for music because listening made her want to sing, and singing was the one thing she had been told she could not do. Then, near 9 o'clock, the night cracked open. A man in a tailored suit stepped onto the small stage and tapped a microphone. The crowd quieted. He wore the strained smile of someone delivering news he would rather not. The evening's headline performer, a celebrated soprano flown in for the occasion, had fallen ill. There would be no main performance. A murmur rolled through the hall, the particular disappointment of people who had paid a great deal to be impressed. And into that thin, awkward silence, a voice rang out, bright and amused. "Well, we can't have silence. It's so common." Genevieve Moore. She turned, glass in hand, her eyes sweeping the room until they found the doorway, and the young woman standing just beyond it. A smile curled at the edge of her mouth, the smile of a cat that has spotted something small to play with. "We have entertainment, don't we?" she called, loud enough for every head to turn. "The cleaning woman's girl says her father was a singer. Says his name is on our wall." She let the words hang, dripping. "Why don't we let her sing for her supper? Go on, let's hear what the gutter sounds like." The laughter started slow, then spread. A few guests lifted their phones, turning the cameras toward the doorway, eager to capture the joke. Someone called out, "This I have to see." Another laughed into his drink. In the back, Della went white. She stepped forward, one hand rising. "Please, she didn't mean any harm. She'll go. We'll both go." "I wasn't asking you," Genevieve said, without even looking at her, and every eye in the room turned to the young woman in the doorway, waiting for her to crumble. Ruby did not crumble. For a moment she only stood there, the laughter washing over her, and the old, familiar weight settled on her shoulders. She knew this feeling. She had felt it in every audition line, every unanswered letter, every door that closed before she reached it. Not you, not your kind, not ever. For 2 years, she had let it bend her into silence. It would have been so easy to bend now. But across the room, her mother was shaking her head, mouthing one word over and over. "No. No. No." And Ruby had stopped looking at her mother. She was looking at the wall, at his name. Otis Anderson. Gold letters in cold brass. And in her mind, she was small again, standing on a milk crate in the basement of a small church, her father's big hands resting on her shoulders. There was no microphone in that basement. There was no money for one. "Sing from your chest, baby," he used to say. "Fill the room with what God gave you, not what the wires give you. If they ever take the power, you keep singing. You hear me? You never need a machine to be heard." She had sung at his funeral with no microphone at all, and the whole church had wept. The laughter in the hall was still rolling, cruel and bright, 200 people certain they knew exactly how this would end. Genevieve watched with her chin lifted, savoring it. The phones glowed in the dark like little eyes. Ruby reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the folded square of paper, soft as cloth. She did not need to read it. She knew every line. She untied the borrowed apron and let it fall. She walked out through the doorway, into the light, and a ripple of delight went through the crowd. The help's daughter was actually going to try. Someone laughed so hard they had to set down their glass. Ruby did not go to the dead microphone on its stand. She stopped beneath the great chandelier, in the open, where her father's name watched over her from the wall. She closed her eyes. She breathed in, the way he taught her, and she opened her mouth to sing. The first note left her like a held breath, finally released. It was a single, clear, rising tone, soft at first, the opening of an old lullaby. But it did not stay soft. It climbed, pure and unbroken, filling the space beneath the chandelier and spreading outward across the marble like water finding every corner of the room. And the laughter died. It did not fade. It stopped, all at once, the way 100 conversations stop when something impossible walks into a room. A man with a glass halfway to his lips simply held it there, forgotten. A waiter froze mid-pour, champagne spilling unnoticed over the rim. The woman who had pressed a napkin to her nose let it slip from her fingers and drift to the floor. 200 faces turned toward the young woman beneath the chandelier, and for the space of a single breath, not one of them remembered how to mock her. Ruby did not see them. Her eyes were closed. She was somewhere else entirely, back in a church basement, her father's hands on her shoulders, the smell of dust and old hymnals in the air. She sang the way he had taught her, from somewhere deep in the chest, the sound rising up through her like it had been waiting 19 years for this exact room. The lullaby unfolded. It was a simple thing, a melody a poor man had written for his daughter so she would have something to hold when he was gone. But in Ruby's voice, it became something vast. The notes bent and ached. They carried a grief no one her age should have known, and underneath the grief, impossibly, a thread of pure joy. The joy of a daughter who had been loved completely by a man who was no longer here. There was no microphone, and the room did not need one. Her voice reached the far walls on its own, climbing into the high dark of the ceiling, slipping between the crystal of the chandelier, settling into the chests of people who had forgotten what it felt like to be moved by anything they had not paid for. The sound did not seem to come from one slight body. It seemed to come from the building itself, as if the old hall had been holding this song in its stones for 100 years, and only now remembered how to sing it. In the front row, a silver-haired man rose slowly from his chair. No one noticed him at first. He stood with one hand pressed flat against his own chest, his eyes fixed on her, his lips slightly parted. He had heard 10,000 voices in his life. He had judged competitions on 3 continents, had discovered prodigies, had sat through performances that made grown audiences weep on command. And he was standing now because his body had stood before his mind had given it permission. Henry Wilson had not planned to feel anything tonight. Around the room, the phones that had been raised to capture a joke were now held in trembling hands, still recording, their owners no longer laughing. One young woman near the bar had tears running down her face and did not seem to know it. A man who, minutes earlier, had called her an animal, now stood with his jaw slack, his glass set down, listening like a man in church. Beside him, his wife had gripped his sleeve without realizing it, her rings forgotten, her painted face undone. Ruby reached the middle of the song, the part her father used to call the climb, where the melody lifted toward something almost too high to reach. She did not strain for it. She simply opened, and the note came, soaring and clean, hanging in the air of that great marble hall like a bird let loose inside a cathedral. The chandelier seemed to shiver with it. High above the crowd, the held note hung and hung, and people who had never in their lives been quiet for a stranger found that they could not breathe through it. A few pressed hands to their mouths. One older woman closed her eyes and let her head tip back, as if the sound were rain after a long drought. And in that moment, the whole architecture of the evening inverted. The 200 richest people in the state, who had gathered to admire themselves, stood silent and small beneath the voice of a ragged young woman they had tried to throw into the street. The marble, the crystal, the gold, all of it, had only ever been a frame. They had simply never had a painting worth hanging in it. Until now. Della stood at the kitchen doorway with both hands pressed over her mouth. The fear had drained out of her face. What replaced it was something close to awe and close to grief. The look of a mother watching her child become, in front of strangers, exactly who she had always known her to be. tears slid down between her fingers. She did not wipe them. She was not thinking about the rent now, or the list, or the checks these people signed. She was only thinking that Otis should have been here to see this, and that, in some way she could not explain, he was. Ruby's voice dropped now, gentling back down from the height, returning to the soft place where the lullaby had begun. The final verse was the tender one, the good night, the part Otis used to sing while tucking the blanket under her chin. She sang it to the room and to no one in the room. She sang it upward, toward the wall, toward the gold letters of his name. Sleep now, little light. The world can wait till morning. The last note thinned to almost nothing, a whisper of sound, and then released into silence. For one full second, the hall did not move. 200 people stood suspended, as if afraid that any sound would break what they had just been given. Then the silence broke, not into polite applause, but into something raw. A sound tore out of the crowd, gasps and cries and the scrape of chairs as people rose to their feet without deciding to. Someone shouted, "Brava!" in a voice cracking with emotion. The applause came like a wave hitting rock, sudden and overwhelming. 200 pairs of hands thundering in a room that, 90 seconds earlier, had been laughing at the young woman who now stood at its center. Ruby opened her eyes. She looked for the first time at what she had done. At the standing crowd. At the weeping strangers. At the silver-haired man in the front row with his hand still on his heart. And in the very front, not standing, not clapping, sat one woman in emerald silk, her champagne glass set down hard on the table, her knuckles white around the stem. Genevieve Moore was not looking at the crowd. She was already leaning toward a man at her side, her lips moving fast and low against his ear, her eyes fixed on the young woman with something colder than anger. But Ruby did not see her yet. Ruby was looking up at the wall, at her father's name, and for the first time in 4 years, she was smiling. The applause did not die down. It built. People were not just clapping now. They were calling out, asking for more, the way a crowd does when it has tasted something it did not know it was starving for. A man in the third row cupped his hands around his mouth. "Another! Sing another!" A dozen voices took up the cry. Phones were lifted again, but gently now, reverently, recording not a joke, but a moment they knew they would want to keep. Ruby looked out at them, uncertain, this young woman who had walked in expecting to be thrown into the street. Slowly, shyly, she nodded. She drew in a breath to begin a second song, an old spiritual her father had loved. She got 3 notes in, and the hall went black. Every light died at once. The great chandelier, the wall sconces, the warm gold glow over the stage, all of it gone in a single hard snap. The music of the room collapsed into startled gasps and the scrape of chairs. Somewhere, a glass shattered. In the sudden dark, 200 people lost their bearings at the same moment, and a nervous, rising murmur began to fill the space where the voice had been. It was meant to end her. That was the cruelty of it. Clean and quiet and deniable. A power flicker. An accident. Who could say? Strip away the light, strip away the stage, and the spell would break. The performance would dissolve into confusion, and she would be just a frightened young woman standing alone in the dark. In the dark, near the front, Genevieve Moore allowed herself a small, satisfied breath. But the voice did not stop. It rose out of the blackness, steady and unshaken, picking up the very note it had been on when the lights died, as if nothing had happened at all. It did not waver. It did not search. It poured into the dark hall, full and warm and utterly certain, and the frightened murmuring of 200 people simply stopped, swallowed whole by the sound of a woman singing in the dark as though she had been born there. Because she had not learned in a place like this. She had learned in a church basement with one bare bulb and no microphone, where her father taught her that the voice does not come from the wires or the lights or the room. Fill the room with what God gave you. If they ever take the power, you keep singing. You never need a machine to be heard. She did not need to see the crowd. She did not need a stage. She had been singing without any of these things her whole life. In the darkness, something extraordinary happened. A single phone light flickered on, raised by a trembling hand, a small, cold star in the black. Then another. Then 10. Then 50. Across the great hall, people lifted their phones and turned on their lights, not to record now, but to give her something to stand in, a constellation of little flames gathering in the dark until the woman at the center of the room was lit by 200 small hands holding up the light. The accident meant to erase her had instead turned the whole room into a cathedral of glowing stars, and in the middle of it, eyes closed, unaware of any of it, Ruby sang. She sang the spiritual all the way through. Wade in the water. Her voice climbed and broke and soared in the dark, and grown men who had come to mock a poor girl stood holding their phones aloft, with tears sliding down their faces, lighting the way for a singer who did not need them to. When the lights finally snapped back on, the hall blinked into brightness, and there she was, exactly where she had been, holding the final note, her chin lifted, her eyes still closed. She had not moved an inch. She had not missed a single note. The blackout had not broken her. It had only proven her. And this time, when the last note faded, there was no pause at all. The hall erupted before the sound had even left the air, the ovation louder and wilder than before. 200 people on their feet, some openly weeping, some shouting her father's name from the wall as if it were hers. But near the front, one woman was no longer in her seat. Genevieve Moore was already moving toward the side of the room, her face white, her jaw set, and she was not finished. She was only changing her weapon. The silver-haired man reached her first. He came up out of the front row while the hall still thundered, moving past the velvet rope as though it were not there, and he crossed the open floor to where she stood blinking in the restored light. The crowd quieted a little when they saw who it was, because some of them knew his face, and the ones who did began to murmur his name to the ones who did not. He stopped a few feet from her and inclined his head, slowly, deeply, the way one artist bows to another. A man who had been bowed to on the great stages of the world bowed now to a young woman in a frayed second-hand dress. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice was not steady. "Ruby," she said. "Ruby Anderson." Something moved across his face. Anderson. He glanced up at the wall, at the brass plaque, at the gold letters she had been reaching for all night. And that lullaby. Where did you learn it? My father wrote it for me. Her chin trembled, but she held his eyes. He sang here once. His name is on your wall. I only wanted to find it. For a long moment the man did not speak. When he did, his words were quiet, but the hall had gone so still that everyone heard them. I have spent 50 years looking for a voice like yours, and I had nearly stopped believing I would hear one again. He turned to face the room, and his voice rang out clear and certain. I want every person here to remember where they were tonight. Remember that you heard her first. The applause that broke this time was different. It was not amusement, and it was not even awe. It was something like shame turning itself inside out into reverence. 200 people clapping for a young woman many of them had laughed at an hour before. And at the edge of the room, watching her triumph crown itself, Genevieve Moore smiled a small, cold smile and lifted her glass like a woman who had just found her opening. Genevieve Moore did not raise her voice this time. She did something far more dangerous. She made it sound reasonable. She stepped out into the open floor, glass in hand, wearing a look of gentle, troubled concern, the expression of a woman who hated to be the one to say it. She waited until the applause thinned, until the room leaned in, and then she spoke in a voice pitched to carry without seeming to try. "It's a lovely story," she said. "Truly. And what a performance." She let the word performance sit there a half-second too long. But I think we owe it to ourselves to be honest about what we just watched. The hall began to quiet, uneasy. "A girl in rags," Genevieve went on, "who just happens to be working our catering staff, who just happens to know exactly where the lights are, who delivers a flawless, rehearsed concert at the precise moment our headliner cancels." She turned a slow circle, meeting eyes. "Doesn't anyone else find that convenient? The dramatic dark, the little folded paper, the dead microphone she conveniently didn't need. She smiled thinly. We are wealthy people, and wealthy people are a target. I have seen this before. A sob story, a viral video, and next come the donation links, the fundraisers, the appeals to our guilt. A murmur rippled through the room, and Ruby watched, in real time, as doubt began to do its quiet work on faces that had been weeping a moment ago. I'm not saying the girl isn't talented, Genevieve said, in the tone of someone being very fair. I'm saying we don't know what this is, or who arranged it. Her eyes slid to the kitchen doorway, to Della, who had come forward and now stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. Perhaps we should ask the mother, the one who put her own daughter on the staff list tonight, and somehow ended up with her singing center stage. Della's mouth opened. Nothing came out. That's what I thought, Genevieve said softly. Then she turned, found the gala coordinator hovering at the side of the room, and let her voice harden into the thing it had been all along. Charlotte, I want this catering company flagged. Tonight. I sit on the board that approves every vendor this hall hires, and I promise you, after this little stunt, that woman will not pour water in this city again. Not at a wedding, not at a funeral. Nowhere. It was precise, and it was cruel, and it was entirely deliverable. With one phone call, the woman in emerald silk could erase Della Anderson's name from every list that fed her family. The threat did not need shouting. Everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. Ruby looked at her mother's face, at the terror returning to it. The same terror she had worn at the start of the night, and something in her chest went very still and very cold. She had broken her promise. She had sung, and now the bill for that song was going to land on her mother. The triumph of a few minutes ago curdled in the room. People who had been on their feet now looked at the floor. The story had turned the way a crowd can turn, and the powerful woman knew it and pressed. So, unless someone has actual proof, Genevieve said, sweeping the room with a final victorious look, that this was anything other than a manufactured little show, I suggest we return to our evening and stop being played for fools. She had built the trap perfectly. She had turned a miracle into a scam, a grieving daughter into a con artist, and the only currency that could buy Ruby out of it was the one thing a young woman in a torn dress was never supposed to have: proof. And in the silence that followed, no one stepped forward. For a long, sickening moment, it looked as though cruelty dressed in reason was simply going to win, the way it so often had in that room, in that city, in that long history of people deciding what a poor girl was worth before she opened her mouth. Then, from the front of the hall, a single voice spoke. "Proof," said Henry Wilson. "Yes, I think we can manage proof." Henry Wilson walked to the center of the floor, and the room remembered who he was. "For those who don't know me," he said, "my name is Henry Wilson. I have spent 50 years on the stages this hall pretends to honor. I have judged the international competitions. I have trained voices that now fill opera houses on 4 continents." He let that settle. "And I came here tonight for one reason, not for the champagne, not for the company." His eyes found Genevieve. "I came because 3 weeks ago a recording reached me. A phone video, badly shot, from a small church across the river. A young woman singing a hymn with no accompaniment. I have listened to that clip more times than I can count, and I came to this city to find the voice that made it." The room was utterly silent now. "I did not know her name until tonight," Wilson said. "I did not know she would be here, of all places, carrying trays behind a kitchen door. But I knew the voice the moment she opened her mouth, because there is only one like it." He turned slowly. "So when you ask for proof that this was not rehearsed, that this young woman is exactly what she appears to be, understand that I have been chasing that proof across 100 miles for 3 weeks. I found it tonight, by accident, in rags." He looked up at the wall then, at the brass plaque, and his voice changed. "And there is something else. That name she was reaching for. Otis Anderson." A long pause. "I knew Otis. 40 years ago we sang in the same company, before his lungs gave out and the doors that opened for me stayed shut for him. He had the better voice. Everyone knew it. The world simply was not built to let a man like him through. His jaw tightened. I have spent a long time being ashamed of that. And tonight, his daughter walked into this hall, and you tried to throw her into the street. No one breathed. But Wilson was not the only one moving now. The story had cracked open, and into the crack stepped others. A young woman near the bar stepped forward, holding up her phone. I recorded the whole thing, from the first note, the lights, everything. It's already uploading. It's got 40,000 views. She turned the screen toward the room, and there it was, the singer beneath the chandelier, the dark, the constellation of phone lights. The numbers on the screen were climbing as they watched. "So is mine," said a man. "And mine." A dozen phones lifted, all of them holding the same impossible thing from a dozen angles, all of them already spreading beyond the walls of that hall, beyond the reach of anyone's phone call, into a world that was beginning to watch. Then a quieter voice spoke from the side of the room. Charlotte Taylor, the gala coordinator, stepped out with a tablet held in both hands, and her face pale with the courage it had taken to move. "Mrs. Moore." Her voice shook, but it held. "You asked me to flag the catering company. I want everyone to know what else I have here." She lifted the tablet. "This is the building's lighting and power log. Every switch in this hall is time-stamped to the second. The main feed didn't fail tonight. There was no flicker, no fault. At 9:41, someone manually killed the house lights from the service panel by the east corridor." She raised her eyes. "I pulled the security camera for that corridor. It shows one person standing at that panel, in an emerald dress." The silence that followed had a different quality. It was the silence of 200 people slowly turning to look at the same place. Della had begun to weep, but these were not the tears from before. She moved through the parting crowd to her daughter and gathered her up, and behind her, one by one, people who had laughed an hour ago now stood and faced the woman in emerald silk. At the back of the room, a heavy-set man in a dark suit had been watching everything in silence. Walter Davis, the conservatory's director, the man whose institution this entire glittering evening existed to fund. He set down his glass, and he started walking toward the center of the floor, and his face was not kind. Genevieve Moore was still not finished. Cornered people rarely are. "A log can be edited," she said, her voice climbing now, the calm cracking at the edges. "A camera angle proves nothing, and a sentimental old man chasing a memory is hardly evidence." She pointed at Ruby, and her hand was not quite steady. "You all want to believe in a miracle. Fine. But none of you actually knows whether this girl can sing a note she hasn't practiced 1,000 times. It's a trick, a trained party piece. Test her, and you'll see." It was meant as a last, desperate swing, but Henry Wilson caught it in the air like a gift. "Yes," he said quietly. "Let's test her." He turned to Ruby, and his voice gentled. "Will you let me? One phrase, something you have never heard. I'll sing it once, and you give it back to me. That's all." Ruby looked at her mother. Della, still holding her, gave the smallest nod. Then she turned back to Wilson and said, "All right." The hall went so quiet you could hear the ice settling in the buckets. Wilson chose something cruel in its difficulty, a phrase from an old aria, full of leaps and turns that took trained sopranos years to master. He sang it once, his aged voice cracking on the high note, then lowered his hand and waited. Across the room, people held their breath. This was the moment Genevieve had gambled on, the moment the trick would fall apart, the moment the poor girl would open her mouth and prove herself ordinary after all. A few of the guests who had laughed earlier leaned forward, half hoping, half dreading. Ruby closed her eyes, and she gave it back to him, note for note, every leap clean, every turn exact. But more than that, she gave it back better, filling the cold, technical line with something warm and aching that Wilson's demonstration had only sketched. She had heard it one time. She returned it as though she had carried it her whole life. The high note that had cracked in his throat came out of hers whole and shining. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman let out a small sob. When she finished, Wilson's eyes were wet. He turned to the room. "That," he said, "is not a trick. That cannot be taught, and it cannot be faked. That is the rarest thing I have heard in 50 years, and it walked in here through the service entrance." The applause began again, but Walter Davis raised a hand, and it stilled. He had reached the center of the floor. He was a large man, slow to anger, the kind who had spent 30 years keeping the peace among wealthy donors. But his face now was hard as stone. "Genevieve," he said, "I have sat on this board with you for 11 years, so I want to be precise about what I watched tonight." He counted it on his fingers, slow and merciless. "I watched you humiliate a young woman for reading a name on a wall. I watched you try to destroy a working mother's livelihood with a phone call. I watched you cut the lights on her to make her fail in front of 200 people. And when that failed, I watched you call her a con artist." He shook his head. "You did not do this to protect anyone. You did it because she walked in with nothing and made every gilded thing in this room look cheap, and you could not stand it." "Walter, you are removed," he said, "as chair of this board. Effective now. The vote is a formality, and you know it." He looked around the silent room. "Anyone who disagrees can leave with her." No one moved toward the door. Genevieve Moore stood alone in the center of the marble floor she had ruled all night. 200 faces turned away from her, the glass still in her hand, the emerald silk suddenly looking like a costume. For the first time, the room saw her not as power, but as a small woman who had mistaken cruelty for stature, and who had just watched the only thing she truly owned, the power to decide who was allowed to be heard, taken from her by a single voice. She set down her glass. She walked out. No one stopped her, and no one followed. And in the quiet she left behind, Henry Wilson turned to Ruby and asked her one more question, loud enough for the room to hear. "How would you like to sing on that stage? Properly, with your father's name above you, where it belongs?" Ruby looked up at the brass letters, then at her mother, then at the silver-haired man, and she said, "Yes." The video did not wait for morning. By the time Della drove their rattling old car home that night, the clip from the bar had crossed 200,000 views. By sunrise, it had passed 4 million. People who had never set foot in a concert hall watched a ragged young woman beneath a chandelier silence a room that had laughed at her, watched the lights die and her voice carry on through the dark, watched 200 phones rise like stars to hold her in the light. They watched a bowing old master tell a marble hall to remember they heard her first. The comments became their own kind of testimony. Mothers wrote that they had wept at their kitchen tables. Men wrote that they had not cried in 20 years. People who had spent their whole lives being judged worthless before they opened their mouths wrote 3 words again and again, until those 3 words became a banner the whole internet seemed to carry at once. Hashtag She Was Heard. It trended for 9 days. But the part the cameras never caught happened a week later, in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, when there was no crowd and no champagne and no one to perform for at all. Henry Wilson kept his word. He arranged an audition at the conservatory, not a charity gesture, not a viral stunt, but a real one, in front of the same faculty who turned away 100 trained hopefuls every year. The same kind of audition Ruby had begged for at 17 and been refused without a hearing. This time, she walked into the room in a clean second-hand dress, with her mother's hand gripping hers, and she sang. There were no lights to cut and no crowd to win. There was only the voice, alone in a plain rehearsal room, and it was enough. It was more than enough. They offered her a full scholarship before she reached the door. Every lesson, every coach, every year of training, paid in full, recorded in the minutes, signed by the director himself. Not a gift handed down out of guilt. A door that should have opened years ago finally pulled wide. Walter Davis signed the letter personally. At the bottom, beneath the official seal, he had added one line in his own hand. "We should have found your father. We will not make that mistake with you. Della read that line in the conservatory parking lot and had to sit down on the curb because her legs would not hold her. 11 years of banquets. 11 years of being told to disappear into the walls. And now, her daughter's name was going up on the same kind of wall that held the name of the man she had loved and buried. As for the woman in emerald silk, there was no dramatic downfall, no headline arrest, no crowd with torches. Life is rarely so tidy. Genevieve Moore simply stopped being asked. The boards she had sat on found reasons not to renew her. The invitations that had filled her calendar thinned and then stopped. The power she had spent a lifetime building, the power to stand at the door and decide who was allowed through it, was quietly taken away, not by a mob, but by the simple fact that the door no longer belonged to her. She had built her whole self on being the one who said no, and the world had stopped asking her permission. The thing she had feared most had come for her after all. Not ruin, just irrelevance. But the picture worth keeping is not the empty chair where Genevieve used to sit. It is a Tuesday, weeks on, in a small church basement across the river, one bare bulb burning overhead. Ruby stands where her father once stood her, and a circle of neighborhood children sit cross-legged on the floor in front of her. She is teaching them the lullaby, the one he wrote, the one that stopped a room of 200. There is no microphone. There has never been one down here. She does not need it. He taught her that. And when the children's small voices rise up to meet hers, off-key and earnest and free, filling that little basement to its low ceiling, you understand the thing the marble hall had to be taught the hard way. A voice does not need permission to be heard. It only needs someone brave enough to open her mouth in a room that told her to be silent. Otis Anderson's name is still on that brass wall. But now, when people stop to read it, they ask whether he was any relation to the singer. So that is the story of the night a ragged young woman walked into a hall full of people who had decided she was nothing, and changed every mind in the room with a single note. But the question this story leaves behind is not really about Ruby Anderson. It is about the rest of us. Talent does not announce itself in the right clothes. It does not arrive through the front door, in silk, with a famous name. Sometimes it comes in a dress 2 years out of fashion, through the service entrance, carrying nothing but a folded scrap of paper and a voice it was told to keep quiet. And the only thing standing between that voice and the silence is whether someone is willing to listen before they judge. Ruby Anderson had been told no since she was a girl. No money, no connections, no hearing. The world had 100 polite ways of closing the door, and for 2 years she believed them. 200 people almost finished the job that night. The only reason they did not is that she was brave enough to open her mouth one more time after a lifetime of being told not to. So here is the question to sit with tonight. If it were you, standing in that doorway, with 200 people laughing, would you have stepped forward and sung? Or would you have disappeared into the walls the way you were told to? Be honest. Drop your answer in the comments, because we read them, and these answers are the best part. And watch the performance again, because there is one detail almost everyone misses the first time. Around the 4-minute mark, just before the lights go out, look at the very edge of the frame, near the east corridor. Someone is already moving toward the panel. The proof was on camera the whole time, before anyone knew to look for it. If this story moved you, give it a like so it reaches one more person who has been made to feel small. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice still matters. And subscribe, because there is always another overlooked soul out there with a gift the world almost missed. Somewhere out there, someone is about to sing their first note. Don't be the one who laughed.